Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Deborah Harris O'Brien. I am the current president of Psych-Hi, and I am very pleased to have a wonderful webinar for you today. I think you're really going to enjoy it with Dr. Tom Davis. Dr. Davis has been teaching at Nichols College since 1996. He does teach undergraduates. Um, he teaches a number of different courses, including cognitive psychology, forensic psychology, general statistics. Nichols is a small college, and at small colleges, often we are generalists and have to teach many courses, many different areas. But his new book that just came out from Macmillan Publishers is called The Psychology Behind Forensic Psychology. And he's going to talk today about some of the concepts that I think many of you as undergraduates will be familiar with and how they apply to forensic psychology. So he's going to do a little presentation, and then we're going to have time at the end for questions and answers. So I hope that you will come up with many questions and comments. So let me turn it over to Dr. Tom Davis.
Terrific. Thank you, Debbie. I appreciate that. Hey, thank you all for joining me here today. You know, one of the areas of psychology that I'm most fascinated with, and I just love to share with people, is forensic psychology. And as I taught this course for over 20 years, I noticed that there were the same myths and misconceptions that kept coming up over and over again. And it wasn't my students' fault. It was really the media portraying it in a different way than you would imagine. We're all fascinated with this area, and that's why, you know, my textbook looks at the facts and the fictions behind forensic psych. And I always try to tell people that sometimes what's more interesting is actually the facts than the fiction. And hopefully you'll see that today. And today, what I'd like to do is kind of walk you through one of the most famous cases in forensic psychology and talk about how different facts and fictions play into that cases. And along the way, I think you'll be surprised at how far psychology has come in unraveling some of the mysteries in this area. And quite literally, if you look beneath the surface of most human behavior, you'll see there's a foundation of psychology. So let's take a look at one of the most classic cases. But first, why are we so fascinated with forensic psych? I mean, you've got CSI Miami, all Special Victims Unit, you've got all of these. And we are fascinated, but it's the kind of thing we really don't want to look at. But at the same time, it's hard to look away. You know, there's basically three reasons that I see most people are fascinated with forensic psych. And the first one is its obvious one, that crime can affect any of us. It doesn't matter what your age is, your gender, your ethnicity, your social status. And it seems to happen randomly. And when it does, it can just devastate people's lives. Another reason we're interested in this area is that the inside world of crime, the work of legal counsel and court proceedings and police investigations, very few of you have ever experienced that firsthand. So we're fascinated because it seems like some kind of a secret world that we're not privy to. But the third reason that drives our obsessions is basically, it's the darkest part of human behavior. And the study of forensic psychology allows us to explore this darkest nature of human behavior from a safe distance. So when you embark on this journey of discovery, you don't know where it's going to take you, but it's always going to be fascinating. So the reason I wrote this textbook and the reason it's called Forensic Psychology, Fact and Fiction is just because of that. There are so many fictions, but the facts are actually more interesting. So let's take a closer look at something here. Let me show you a couple of facts and fictions. I'd like you to take a look at these and just decide for yourself whether in the field of forensic psychology, this is a fact or a fiction. So the first one, eyewitnesses are a reliable source of information. True or false? I'll give you the answers in just a minute. Let's take a look at another one. Human memory works a lot like a video camera. The idea that a person, really, you cannot have a memory of something that never happened. Let's take a look at three more. Victims of violent crime are never blamed for the crimes they suffer from. The idea that long prison terms are the best way to prevent future crimes. And finally, the key component of forensic psychology is offender profiling. Here we have 6 different ideas, and all of them are fiction. Every single one of these is false, and I'll show you how false they are in just a moment. But most people believe that these are actually true. From eyewitnesses being a reliable source of information to the idea that the key component of forensic psych is offender profiling. Let's take a closer look at this. And one of the best ways to take a look at it is apply all 6 of these to one of the most famous case studies. And that's the case of Ronald Cotton and Jennifer Thompson. In the provocatively titled book, Picking Cotton, exoneree Ronald Cotton, who you see there on the left, and Jennifer Thompson Cano are intimately related. And to look at that picture, you would think that they are friends. They are now, but it's hard to believe what they actually went through. Exoneree Ronald Cotton and abuse victim Jennifer Thompson Cano, they tell an emotional story of misidentification and wrongful conviction in North Carolina. Back in 1984, a black man broke into her apartment while she was asleep and raped Jennifer. Jennifer at the time was a college student held at knife point. So even as she screamed, even as her attacker shoved her down on the bed, pinning her hands behind her, this 22-year-old college student knew exactly what to do. She decided she would outsmart her rapist. She would remember everything about him that night, his voice, his hair, his leering eyes. She would try to trick him into turning on the light so she could study his features for facial scars, tattoos, anything that would help her identify him later. During the assault, she even had the presence of mind to study her attacker and try to memorize his appearance. She offered him a drink, and as she did, she escaped. But what's really interesting is in suffocating terror of that shattered summer night, Thompson made a vow to herself that she would survive, that she would track down this stranger who had smashed into her life, and if she couldn't kill him, she'd do the next best thing. She'd send him to prison for the rest of her life. So 3 days later, the police department, where she was at, helped her create a composite sketch. Cotton, who you see on the left, was arrested shortly afterwards. Now, the police were interested because in 2 separate incidents in July of 1984, an assailant had broken into an apartment, cut the phone wires, sexually assaulted a woman, and searched through her belongings, taking money and other items. So they thought these two incidents were actually related. So even though Jennifer was unsure that Ronald was her rapist, she spent much more than the normal amount of time studying the photo array and eventually selected a photo of Ronald. After her choice, the investigators told Jennifer that she had done just a great job. Later, she viewed the physical lineup, in which the only member who had been in the previously presented photo array was actually Ronald Cotton. So a week later, she sat in front of sat across a table from 6 men holding up numbered cards in a physical lineup. And there was no one-way mirror to shield her. Each one walked up and repeated the words, "Shut up or I'll cut you." And Thompson picked number 5. She said, "That's my rapist," identifying him for a second time. The detective told her, "We thought that might be the guy. It's the same person you picked from the photo." Ronald, who actually had kind of a weak alibi and a minor criminal record, was tried, convicted, and sentenced to life plus 54 years for first-degree rape, first-degree sexual offense, and first-degree breaking and entering. Now, Thompson has told this story many times, but the most powerful was the first time in court. Now, remember, this was back in 1984, and many of you might be thinking, well, why not just get DNA evidence at this point? Well, this was before DNA evidence use was widely available. During his time in prison, Ronald was a model prisoner who continued to profess his innocence every single day. But something strange happened. One day, a fellow prisoner who bore an extremely strong resemblance to him showed up. His name was Bobby Leon Poole. Ronald Cotton intuitively knew that Bobby was the rapist for whom he was actually doing time. As further evidence, he later got a tip from a fellow inmate that Poole had bragged about raping 2 white women. Bobby denied the statement, and the alleged confession did not sway another trial with a prosecutor or judge. Then the Innocence Project stepped in. This is a global organization whose mission is to exonerate the wrongfully convicted, and they're found throughout many colleges and universities. So they arrived and they re-examined the evidence. Fortunately, they found a small sample of DNA that was still well preserved. Ronald Cotton had spent 10.5 years in prison before the DNA test cleared him of rape and identified the real rapist, who was indeed Bobby Leon Poole. The police told Jennifer that the DNA testing had proven Ronald innocent and implicated Bobby as the real perpetrator. Beyond shocked, beyond overcome with feelings of guilt. But soon Jennifer came to realize that eyewitness misidentification is not rare. And surprisingly, she didn't recognize Bobby Poole even at his trial. Now, in 1995, Ronald Cotton was exonerated and released. And one of the most amazing things, he forgave Jennifer for 10.5 years in prison. They actually became good friends and now travel the world together to educate the public about wrongful convictions and reforms, especially in relation to eyewitness identification procedures. This is truly a case of misidentification, but there's a lot of fictions that are associated with this. I mean, we take one of the first ones that we just mentioned. Eyewitnesses are a reliable source of information. Now, here's what's fascinating to me is that juries consider eyewitness accounts the second most persuasive piece of evidence to prove guilt. Of course, what's the most persuasive piece? A signed confession. But juries really look at eyewitnesses. Eyewitness evidence is powerful because lawyers, judges, juries, the public, you and I, we all believe that the way we remember an event has to be the way it happened. But mistaken eyewitness identifications contribute to 69% of more than the 375 wrongful convictions in the United States alone, those that were overturned by DNA evidence. I mean, it's a moral injustice, obviously. But false convictions, inaccurate eyewitnesses can mislead the initial stages of police investigations. That's one of the problems with eyewitness testimony. Inaccurate eyewitness information wastes valuable time following false leads. Meanwhile, the real offender can still remain free to commit more crimes. So, how was Jennifer's confidence in her mistaken identification manipulated by the detectives? You probably already figured it out. Although the witnesses can often be very confident that their memory is accurate when identifying a suspect, human memory is malleable, it's plastic, and visual perception makes eyewitness testimony one of the most unreliable forms of memory and unreliable forms of evidence. So information from before and after a crime can actually alter Jennifer's choice of Ronald Cotton. If you remember right, where did she first see Ronald Cotton? She saw Ronald Cotton in the photo array. Okay. And the police told her, yeah, that's the one we thought it was too. So the police actually made her feel more confident in her choice. It took her a long time, and human memory doesn't work like that. She didn't remember that the first time she saw Ronald Cotton was actually in the photo array. She believed that her ability to recognize him during the physical lineup was from the night of the attack and not from the photo array, which it actually was. So this is actually in psychology, we call this a source monitoring error. And basically, we all make the mistake because the information that we learn is more important than remembering its source. You remembered learning the definition of psychology, but not when and where you learned it. So while there's a number of factors that come into play when someone's recounting events that they believe took place during a particular event, common factors like stress, cross-culture and racial differences, and even post-event factors change our eyewitness reports. So we know that eyewitnesses are not that accurate. We also know, in this case, human memory does not work like a camera at all. In fact, it's completely different. So the amount of time it took Jennifer to recognize Ronald Cotton's photo from the photos indicates a problem with her memory. Recognition memory, it's extremely fast. It's quick. Okay. In fact, whole sections of our cortex are dedicated to recognizing faces. So when she spent even more than just 10 seconds, it actually took her 5 minutes, to identify him from the photo array, that should have been an indicator to the police that something wasn't right at this point. So remembering and forgetting are intertwined. New theories from cognitive psychology suggest that our memories are actually an act of creative reconstruction, not just recall. On a literal level, it's an act of creation. We're reconstructing those memories. Maybe our memories are more like painting or sculpture, where everyone is constantly becoming their own artist. We're taking bits and pieces of experience whenever you pull them out, and sometimes things get sharpened, sometimes they get leveled and infused with our imagination. And so out of these memories that we construct, they actually feel like real memories. And in fact, you can't tell the difference. So a memory, it is a real thing. It's a trace made largely of proteins, and it's a structure that connects one brain cell to another. And the act of remembering is literally an act of creation. Every time you recall any event in your life, any memory, it's an act of creation and imagination. However, as scary as this sounds, every time you remember something, you change that memory just a little bit. Something that took place 30 years ago is going to alter a memory that you have now. Actually, what you remember is a memory in the light of today. So does that mean there's no such thing as a memory for all time that hides in some secret vault and somewhere where you've all got this most perfect recollection? There isn't a real memory. And some people ask, well, how do I know that any memory that I have is verifiably true? And the sad thing is, you don't. And I'm going to tell you something right now, is that there is no such thing as a real memory. And most of you say, but I know my memories are real, I can verify them. They continually change. Let me try to convince you about that. When you remember something, the more it becomes, the less about you, more about you and the less about what happened. Just imagine something. Imagine a couple that's in love and it's their first kiss. He kisses her, she kisses him back. She remembers the kiss and he remembers the kiss. And as they go through the rest of their romance in the next, say, 30, 40 years together, the kiss will essentially become replaced by two independently, increasingly dishonest kisses, assuming that they think about that enough. The moment their lips separated, their memories began to separate. They diverged, and that memory changed. If we were during class right now, I'd probably cue the really sad music at this point. They just grow slowly farther apart, their memories do. So the moral of the story is the more a witness retrieves the memory, the further away from reality it travels. And this is the point of forensic psychology. Forensic psychologists know how to use the principles of cognitive psychology to teach police departments, detective interviewers, child psychologists, how to retrieve memories. This is why probably one of the most important tasks for the forensic psychologist is to teach police how to keep a memory free from contamination. If you think about it, the way the police are trained to maintain physical evidence like DNA or fingerprints, well, now we treat memories the same way. They are fragile and they have to be preserved because memories can be easily contaminated. Another interesting point in this case, and a myth that's also related to it, is the idea that a person can't have a memory of something that never happened. If not from the original traumatic event, where did Jennifer's memory of Ronald Cotton come from? The key thing was, even when she was confronted with the actual perpetrator, Bobby Poole, Jennifer Thompson's altered memory only recalled Ronald Cotton. Her memory of Cotton felt stronger and more real to her than the actual memory. And so here's the deal. You cannot tell a real memory from a false one. To us, they feel the same. They're part of the same process. False memories can be created in a number of different ways. Scarily so. Let me demonstrate this. So if you have just a moment, let me read this list to you, okay? After I finish the list, I want you to just count to 15 and see how many of these words that you can remember. Ready? Steal, robber, jail, villain, bandit, criminal, rob, police, money, bad, burglar, crook, crime, gun, and bank. Now count to 15. Now think about the words you just heard. Try to recall them. Do you remember hearing the word thief? If so, you're the victim of an implanted false memory. You might not have done it, but approximately 30% of people that hear that list recall the word thief. Now, it's not in there. You can go back and rewind if you don't believe me. I never said that word. What's interesting is that people report that they're sure they remembered the word, which is literally an example of a false memory, something that never occurred. Well, why does it happen? Well, false memory, as you remember, is a source monitoring error. Simply we remember thinking about the missing word while reading the list. It had to have been in there because thief is related to all those other words, and it comes up. Source monitoring errors are often the reason that people have a memory for even crimes that they didn't commit or things that happened in their life that never actually happened. So Jennifer was not lying. So tools like, say, if you tried to hook her up to a polygraph, even if the polygraph was a valid way to detect lies, it wouldn't have been effective. So despite the belief that people don't confess to crimes they didn't commit, many people have been convicted, they have been prosecuted, and they've been imprisoned because of false memories and false confessions. And it's not a new phenomenon. So what I find interesting is that forensic psychologists not only have to know about false memories, but they have to be careful when they interview eyewitnesses and witnesses to any crime, because the power of suggestion, just like I showed you, can change your memory. I mean, suppose you witnessed a crime and the police asked you some questions later and they said, did you see a red VW leave the scene? And you're thinking about it and you're going, no red VW. And you didn't see one. But then maybe the police person asks you again, are you sure you didn't see a red VW? And suddenly you're like, well, I think maybe there might have been, but I don't think so. I probably forgot. And then you start to question because you're remembering something. And here you've created an unstable memory. Now the memory comes back, and at this point it's fragile and it's unstable and can be easily changed. And then it becomes rebuilt and recreated. And in that moment, someone, without even meaning to, can slide something new in. So now the memory is fragile, and as the memory gets restored, we insert the memory of a red VW. And the next day, when the judge or attorney asks you, was there somebody there? Was there a red VW there? And from your perspective, it's now a real memory. And what's so fascinating to me about that phenomenon is that the red VW is now in your head. It's vivid, it's technicolor, it's real to you. You can see it. You can picture the light bouncing off the hood. It feels real. It's amazing how detailed these meanings can be. And this is also why when somebody contradicts your memory and says it didn't happen like you thought it did, you're like, we get angry because it feels like they're taking a real memory from us. In fact, many researchers like Elizabeth Loftus back in the mid-'80s started this phenomenon looking at the psychological principles of false memories. And she was looking at people that believed in satanic cults and child abuse. And unfortunately, so many people believe this that it really didn't happen. In fact, the FBI has yet to prosecute one case of satanic abuse. It never happened. Another interesting case that fortunately in forensic psych did not happen to Jennifer, but believe it or not, many victims of violent crime, are blamed for the crime they suffered from. Jennifer was fortunate in that the judge, jury, police, they didn't blame her for being a victim of crime, but tragically victims are often blamed for just being that, for being a victim. And so in forensic psych, we like to ask this question, and it's in the field of forensic psych known as victimology, studying victims. Why are victims blamed? And so we look at how victims are blamed and how the life of a victim happens, and we study them because we want to know, do victims precipitate their role in crime? In other words, is there something that victims all do that makes them become victims of crime? Now, I want to point out that victimology does not blame victims. We are not blaming a victim for their crime. One of the biggest factors for people blaming victims is what's known as the just world hypothesis. And in the field of psychology, and this is the field of social psych, we have this need for predictability. The idea basically is that people deserve what happens to them, and there's a strong need to believe that we all deserve our outcomes and consequences. Because if something you did causes you to be a victim, then the world is not a random place. And the world's more predictable. And if we hold victims responsible for their misfortune and blame them, then I wouldn't do what happened to them and it wouldn't happen to me. Crime wouldn't be random. So the idea is that even if you do everything right, basically a lot of victims and people around them, they blame victims because it makes us feel safer, which is really a shame. It's entirely universal. We do it in all countries. We see it in all countries, unfortunately. And victim blaming often brings to mind crimes like sexual assault, domestic violence, and it occurs in all countries and all cultures. Murders, burglaries, abductions, whatever the crime, people tend to blame the victim as a defense mechanism so we can avoid it ourselves. So this is another area that forensic psychologists, we work with victims. We help them understand that it's not their fault. But we also examine the behaviors of victims in such areas as cyber stalking. And that's a fascinating area I look at in my own book. Another area that we talk about in myths is this idea that long prison terms are the best way to prevent future crimes. Long prison terms are based on the idea, especially in America, that basically punishment will deter crime. It's an element of what we call deterrence theory, and this veers on the area of criminal justice. So in our criminal justice system, one thing that we do know is that in July 1995, the governor of North Carolina officially, finally pardoned Ronald Cotton, and he was cleared of all his charges, but it was only after 10.5 years in prison. So the question that forensic psychologists ask is, why do we put people in prison? Is to protect society, to rehabilitate people, to punish people. There's no right answer because the case can be made for any of these options. But we do know that prison changes people. It alters their spatial, temporal, and body dimensions. It weakens their emotional life. It undermines their identity. And what psychological impact does prison have? Basically, we now know that it can cause mental disorders in people that were psychologically healthy before they entered prison. For inmates, basically what happens in prison, there's two timelines. The first is tied to their daily routine, and it's extremely repetitive. Prisoners cannot choose when to eat, when to bathe, when to sleep, when to awaken. Other people make those decisions for them. The second timeline is they get out of sync with the external world. And this raises questions of desocialization, of incarceration. Basically, we don't see data supporting longer prison terms with less crime, unless you look at the very short term at very large number of people being incarcerated. The idea of prison doesn't deter crime because to be successful in deterrence, it would have to do three things that our society is not ready to do. Psychologically, we know from principles of punishment, learning, and operant conditioning that punishment is only effective if it does three things. If it is fast, in other words, if from the moment you committed the crime, the very next day you would be put into prison. If it is severe, we know for punishment to work, you have to use the most severe, highest level of punishment. There's no such thing as 3 strikes laws. There would be no such thing as a slap on the wrist for the first time you committed a crime. It would be the most severe level of punishment. And it has to be certain. For punishment to be effective, it has to be administered certainly the same way to every single person, regardless of the quality of your defense or what state you committed the crime. So this is one of the main reasons that I'm always fascinated with punishment, that it just doesn't work because it's not fast, it's not severe enough, and it's not certain enough. And these are 3 areas of our criminal justice system that we're really not ready to do. And last but not least, one of the myths of forensic psychology is that the key component is offender profiling. Now, in the case of Ronald Cotton, he was exonerated through DNA evidence. The real offender, Bobby Poole, remember, was caught by DNA evidence, not by offender profiling. Most cases are solved this way, and only a small percentage of cases lend themselves to offender profiling. Mainly the large number of offenders, the larger the more number of offenders, the more accurate profiling will be. So in the field of the crime of serial killers, fortunately, there's very few serial killers, thank goodness. But that also makes it very hard to profile. Profiling works better for very large, frequently committed crimes, like financial fraud, shoplifting, things like that. So many of my students want to become profilers, and you might too, and I can't blame you. The profession's often shown as glamorous and exciting, where the profiler comes in from out of town within a day, solves the crime by identifying the killer that the police spent years on, or so it goes in the entertainment media. It's driven by popular interest, and we would love to see a more effective criminal justice system. However, in the field of this profiling, there's a shroud of secrecy that surrounds the practice. And as you know, this is at odds with true science. So it's captured the public's fascination. There's all kinds of references to it. But fortunately, It is a real thing, but not in the way you think it is. The traditional forms of profiling shown on television, movies, entertainment media, books, true crime novels, and podcasts, it's becoming more scientific. It's using more research methods. Yet the barriers for accepting profiling testimony in the courtroom still remain. There's alternatives to profiling that are amazing. For example, investigative psychology by David Cantor is a whole other approach that's based on real scientific information. What you see on television is based on the FBI's original pattern called the criminal investigative analysis approach, based on Freudian and psychodynamic principles that don't seem to have a lot of usefulness. Another area that's fascinating is the area of geographic profiling and crime linkage analysis. So if you're thinking about forensic psychology and becoming a forensic psychologist, one of the areas to take a look at is to get a further degree in the field of clinical psychology, specializing in forensic psych, but also as an undergraduate. Don't be afraid to take courses in statistical analysis and research design. That'll also help you tremendously. So when I investigated this field, and as I've seen for many decades, this book is truly a journey of discovery for me. When I wrote this book, I was surprised at how many myths and misconceptions people did believe in. I've taken the perspective of looking at it from the perspective of a case and how that case demonstrates the myths and misconceptions, the facts and the fictions in the field of psychology. And it is a voyage of discovery. If you like this area, I hope you'll check it out and join me on this voyage of discovery and keep investigating, for the field is dynamic and it's changing at all times. So thank you very much for listening to me describe this single case. And if we have time, and I think we do, I'd like to entertain some of your questions if you have some for me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Davis. Very interesting. If people have questions, we invite you to turn on your mic. You can also turn on your camera if you'd like to share with us and ask questions. I'm going to monitor the chat if you prefer to ask questions in the chat, and I'll read questions to Dr. Davis.
I have a question.
Sure.
I'm really interested in kind of reforming punishment, reforming things within the criminal justice system. I was wondering, what kind of educational background and experience would you have, and what would that kind of entail?
Mm-hmm. An interesting question. Thank you for that. And I tell you, I admire you asking that question because it definitely needs to be reformed. I would take a look, if I was an undergraduate and if I was doing it all over again as you were, I would think about looking into the field graduate studies of criminology. Criminology is really looking at a combination of criminal justice, psychology, sociology, and you're taking a look at how these principles in criminology can be applied to reform the criminal justice system from larger perspectives. For example, as you just mentioned, does punishment actually work? Deterrence. I just scratched the surface today, but there's so many theories about why deterrence works and doesn't work. And I admire your willingness to get into this area. In fact, even in forensic psych, in the field of prison psychology, they're looking at so many different reform programs right now, from behavioral management to looking at something called the strengths-based approach for people that are imprisoned, and not just imprisoned falsely, but people that are looking to change. And it's a very positive program. So long story short, I'd recommend take a look at criminology and see where that leads you. Thank you for that question. Next.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Cameron, for your question. We have some questions in the chat now, Dr. Davis. Jessica Aguilar, what are some effective policies that can be implemented in the criminal justice system based on research?
Good point. Let's just take one area to look at, and that's the policy of solitary confinement. just one area that's used as a form of punishment. We know, can you imagine spending months in a box that is 6 feet by 9 feet with no interaction with anyone, just the guards every now and then? There's no stimulation whatsoever. We hear cases of people in solitary confinement that begin to hallucinate. We know that solitary confinement makes people any kind of a mental distress or disability that you have, they'll make it worse. And as a form of punishment, it doesn't work. In fact, we know that it actually makes the problem worse. People that were put into solitary confinement because of things like being too aggressive, not following the rules, they're more likely to be desocialized when they get out, and it doesn't seem to work at all. Many European communities have limited, if not eliminated, solitary confinement. So that's one area of the criminal justice system that we can take a look at. Another area that I find fascinating, that I talk about in my textbook, is this whole idea: do prisons have to be ugly to be effective? It turns out they don't. It turns out that prison and punishment, what's the goal? Is it really about reforming and punishing people even more? Or is it really about giving people the skills to behave in ways that they can function in society? So we have to make a decision. And the decision is based on B.F. Skinner's theories of operant conditioning. Are we here to punish people, or are we here to rehabilitate people? And right now, it looks like you can't have it both ways. We're going to have to make a decision in our society, and people like you are going to have to help in our decisions, hopefully to reform people. Thank you very much for that question. It's an intriguing one.
Thank you, Jessica. We have a question from Chloe, who wants to know, how do you become a forensic psychologist if the graduate programs around you do not offer this area of study?
Good question. And you know what, Chloe, thank you. I have the same exact question from my own students. And it makes sense, because you're thinking, I want to become a forensic psychologist, therefore I need to find a program that is called forensic psychology. Not necessarily. Many forensic psychologists are clinical psychologists that have specialized in the field of forensic psychology. In fact, I would recommend that you think about specializing in clinical psychology, because this will give you the skills and the background to specialize and work with, say, assessing child custody or assessing insanity defense claims, etc. That's typically the route that most people go. So a clinical program will give you that specialized ability. And clinical PsyD programs, I think I saw someone ask that question, as well as a PhD program in clinical psych. I think you'll really like graduate school anyway. It's very different than undergraduate. Thank you.
Well, that relates to Macy's question about recommending. She wanted to know if you recommended going into clinical psychology with a forensic focus or something that's strictly forensic. And she wants to know, can you do things with a master's degree, or do you need to go to the doctoral level?
You can do some things with the master's degree, but I recommend the doctoral level. The reason behind that is it's pretty much all about options. It will give you more options, better quality of life, and better job satisfaction. But also, many certifications require a PhD or a PsyD level of training.
All right, thank you so much. Great questions. Does anyone want to ask questions in person?
I just put mine in the chat, but I can just ask it here. I just wondered what your thoughts were on using like psych hospitals and mental health reform as opposed to using the criminal justice system for certain individuals that qualify in that way.
Yeah, thank you for that. You know, one of the problems that's happened in America in the last 20 years is that funding has been cut so severely for many psych hospitals that people that need help now are being sent to prisons, which cannot provide the level of help. I mean, there's one prison psychologist. There's just not the level of help for people that really need it. And you've got people now that are in prison that really need psychiatric help and assistance. So I'm really against prisons trying to do the job of a psychiatric hospital. Yet, you know, there still needs to be training. And I'm always reminded of one of my favorite studies, and that's the classic Rosenhan experiment, where he was a psychology professor in social psych that asked his graduate students to just try to get themselves admitted to a psychiatric hospital. And all they said was, I hear the word thud. Thud. That's it. All of them were admitted, including Rosenhan himself. But when they were admitted to the hospital, they no longer presented any psychiatric symptoms. And they were all admitted. They were all diagnosed with schizophrenia in remission. And they took notes during their stay in the hospital and acted perfectly normal. And the psychiatrist had written down things: patient exhibits strange note-taking obsessions. But you know what was fascinating? None of the hospitals diagnosed them as being frauds. But in those hospitals, the other patients actually diagnosed the people that were faking it. They knew they were faking. And so, of course, the hospitals were upset with this. And so they told Rosenhan, we didn't know. So do it again, and we promise that we will be able to identify these people that are frauds. So he told them, all right, in the next 2 weeks, I will. And so at the end of 2 weeks, they identified 44 frauds that Rosenhan had sent over to these hospitals. And interestingly enough, Rosenhan reported, I didn't send anyone. So the whole idea here is that we often look for things that we think we're going to see. And so even in the psychiatric hospitals, they've gotten much better, but there's still a need for more funding and more reform. And I hate to see people that are in true diagnostic need being sent to prisons where they just can't get the help they need. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. I agree. That's actually a field that I'd like to go into. I'm currently in grad school, and I'd like to work in the criminal justice system with reform. So do you think that funding is really like the best place to start to fix that problem?
I think so. I do think that taking a really scientific approach and showing which programs, rehabilitation programs, actually work the best. And that seems to be where Europe seems to be a little bit ahead of us in some areas.
Mm-hmm.
A strength-based approach, it's called. You might want to check that out. Seems to be one of the best areas that seems to be effective right now. But one of my favorite areas is areas where they have prisoners that are training service dogs and service animals, and it works.
Yeah.
So that's one of my pet favorite programs out there right now. And I think that one works as well. But thank you. That was an excellent question.
Thank you so much.
We have another question from Jacqueline, who is interested in seeking justice and helping children who are the victims of abuse and rape. And she wants to know if forensic psychology would be a good route to go into.
All right. I admire your dedication. You know, one of the things in working with children, especially abused children, is that there is a high level of burnout. It is extremely difficult and challenging, and it's not for the faint-hearted. But with that being said, it's an admirable profession, and it's needed. We now know that children are every bit as good a witness as adults. We have found that out through many different studies. But one of the things I found in my book, and I would recommend going into this area, in fact, there's a whole extremely well-developed protocol in working with children, and it's called the NICID protocol, and it's basically the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development protocol. And it is a step-by-step process that maintains the memories of these children and yet preserves their dignity and keeps them safe. And in fact, one of the areas that is really interesting, in many European communities, they have something called the barn house, which means children's house. And they're entire dedicated locations, and they are designed only to help and interview children in a very safe manner. Because as you can imagine, a forensic interview It's very, very different than a clinical interview. In a clinical interview, you're trying to develop the child emotionally and help get them through the experience. In a forensic interview, it's all about information, and that's the big difference. So if I was going into this area, I would think about child psychology and not forensic psych. Child psych, because number one, there truly are not enough of them. Many years ago, when we had, in my home state of Connecticut, the Newtown shooting disaster, where so many innocent children were killed, one of the problems they found, which was really hard, is that there were not enough child psychologists. So that's definitely a field that needs more people. So I would consider that if I were you and you want to work in this area. But definitely do an internship first to make sure that that's something that you really you can handle. All right. Thank you.
Oh, I think that's a very good suggestion. I'm a clinical child psychologist, and I can back Dr. Davis up on the fact that this is an area where there's a lot of burnout, where it's just not for everybody. It's very difficult. So before you spend all those years in graduate school, make sure that it's something that you really can do.
And Debbie, that for all of you listening, that's the advantage of an internship. It not only tells you what you love to do, but don't be afraid if you do an internship and you find yourself saying, I'm not sure if this is my area. And many of my students have come back to me and said that. And I said, that's also a successful thing. Do it now instead of as a career.
Yes, I would echo the same thing from my many years of teaching. Sometimes students think they want to do something, and they do the internship and they find out that's not for them, and they get very discouraged. But actually, it's much better to find it out at the undergraduate level and to know that this is not something you want to do, and then you can kind of figure out what it is you want to do. We have another question here in the chat from Raphael. If we want to consider preventing the rise of sexual crimes, will reforming minor sexual crimes such as voyeurism, like upskirting, through rehab programs, prevent them from committing more severe sexual crimes such as rape, or will punishment be more effective?
Good question. We're still looking at that. What you're really asking is, where does the research support? And so theoretically, you would think that by more rehabilitation and more, I hate to say punishment for the less severe crimes, then maybe that will stop it. The challenge for our area is that many of those early crimes are undetected. And so we only see them at a later route where they're much more severe. And it is surprising that we're starting to look at crimes because of technology now that are much more similar and different at the same time. Example, stalking and cyber stalking. There are many similarities between the two as far as what starts both of them. In fact, we're finding out that just what you suggested, that early detection of cyber stalking and how victims relate to their stalker is much more effective than in real world stalking, let's call it. But the motivations are similar, except that in cyber stalking, it's much more widespread. And the research suggests now that there's equivalent rates of men that are stalked as well as women. But the motivations are very similar. And so technology is changing quickly how we look at some of these. It actually might help us treat, deal with, and cope with some of these voyeuristic crimes that we look at. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that question. Do we have anyone else? We just have a minute or two left. If anybody else would like to either enter a question in the chat, or if you'd like to voice your question, turn on your mic, and you may turn on your camera. We'd love to see you as well. Okay, well, we will close up here. I want to thank all of you for participating, and I hope that you got some interesting information out of this, both about the field of forensic psychology and answers to questions you might have about a career in it, and that you can relate some of these things that Dr. Davis talked about to things you've already learned in psychology. So you've already learned things like the just world hypothesis in social psych. You've learned operant conditioning principles. So there are many, many things that the field of forensic psychology is based on more basic research in psychology. So there's a lot of ideas here that you can take, and particularly the idea of memory and knowing how memory is not as permanent and unchangeable as we think it is. So I want to thank Dr. Davis again, and thank students for participating. If you've enjoyed this webinar and you want to refer a friend to it, it is being recorded and will be posted on the PsychHigh website. Give us about a week to get it edited and posted, but anyone can go to the PsychHigh website, www.psichi.org, and this webinar is available. We also have other webinars and podcasts on different areas in psychology, and there's a lot of great resources there for those of you who are interested in graduate school. Many, many resources about applying to graduate school, getting good letters of recommendation, interviews, which are particularly important in clinical psychology. So I invite you to take advantage of all of the resources that we have. Right now, during the pandemic, PsychHigh is making all of our resources on our website available to anyone, whether they are a PsychHigh member or not. So thank you again, Dr. Davis, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day.
Thank you very much. And always remember that sometimes the facts are more interesting than the fictions. Have a good day. Thank you all very much for your comments.